Today. Trauma and PTSD amongst women is the topic for today's discussion. How can the process of self healing begin? We're going to discuss this topic with Jeannine Rashidi, who is an Ayurvedic practitioner for the last 17 years. Her area of focus is on alleviating the core of physical, emotional, and mental tension. Jeannine is currently enrolled in the Ayurvedic doctorate program at the Kerala Ayurveda Academy, California. I am Amita from Narishta, a global platform for natural and holistic therapies. I'd like to introduce all of you to Jeannine Rashidi, who is joining us live from San Jose, California. Welcome, Jeannine.
Thank you, Amita. Can you all hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear today.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. It is an honor, so thank you. So today's topic, trauma and healing the relationship with myself. So I'd first like to share my vision, and that is to bring about a revolution in how we relate harmoniously between the heart and mind with ourselves and others. So today's topic, PTSD and trauma, which is a surviving mindset, how I healed the relationship with myself, coming into a thriving mindset, where I've created the adhere process, as well as becoming a doctor of Ayurveda. So we first need to understand what is post-traumatic stress disorder. And if you know anyone or if you're someone who's had trauma, just let us know in the chat, give a thumbs up, especially for anyone who might be watching this in the future, just to let people know that they're not alone. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a disorder in which a person has difficulty recovering after experiencing or witnessing a terrifying event, in my case, many events. And this condition can last months or years with triggers that can bring back memories of the trauma, accompanied by intense emotional and physical reactions. So from an Ayurvedic perspective, this is what we know as undigestible experiences known as ama. So when we ingest food, if it doesn't transform, it becomes undigestible, it creates stagnation, which is a breeding ground for disease. The same thing can happen in the mind, and that's what happens with trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. So the first 25 years of my life were ongoing psychological, sexual, emotional, and physical abuse. Cycles of dysfunction, they repeat themselves if they are ignored. This is a key point in this entire presentation and in my journey. So a bit of a timeline. I was born into addiction and violence. My parents, they were very imbalanced. The cycles that they had gone through had been ignored. Now, I was fortunate enough that I had some really amazing teachers throughout school who were aware of what was going on at home. And so they took me under their wing, and I had my emotional needs met, my educational needs met. They provided a space where I could do my studies and excel in school, as well as show me how to get involved with extracurricular activities like music and sports, which meant less home time. And this was great. I was a straight A student. By the time I got into high school, I'm choosing my own classes, and I start looking for the class that will teach me how to deal with what's going on at home. Well, there is no such class. To this day, I don't believe there is either. And so even though I was destined to go to college and get a scholarship, staying at home up until that point felt like an eternity, and that anything would be better than that. So I decided to run away from home, and I hitchhiked from Northern California all the way to Southern California, and I learned how to live homeless. Now, many amazing experiences and survival skills came out of learning how to live homeless, but it also brought its own level of trauma, as you can imagine, a young girl at 15 living homeless. Now, I learned where all of the soup kitchens were. I learned where to sleep, how to, where to shower so that it wasn't obvious that I was living homeless. And during that time, I met a man who was a bit older than I was, and we connected through our trauma. So he had childhood trauma, I had childhood trauma, and so we related in that way. What I didn't realize at this point when I entered into this relationship was that I was about to enter into the same type of situation that I had just left home from. The cycle was about to repeat itself. So I'm in this relationship and I become pregnant at 16. And I decide to marry him at 17. Now, of course, this was a very naive move, but I was still a child. And I had this belief that marriage would fix everything. Somehow he would no longer be an addict. Somehow he would no longer be abusive and we would live happily ever after. Well, that was not the case. I had my second daughter by the time I was 20. And I was the sole provider, the only one who could hold a job, obviously. And after some time, it became clear with the behavior that I started noticing in my own children that history had repeated itself almost to the letter. And this broke my heart because I had left home with the intention of creating a different life for myself. And now I had gone into the same situation, which is quite statistically what it tends to happen if you don't deal with your trauma. You either end up becoming a perpetrator, not by intention, but because you haven't dealt with it, or you end up in the same cycle and attracting that same type of partner or going into that type of scenario. And that's exactly what happened. So it took quite a while for me to be able to leave that situation. There were multiple attempts, and each attempt, of course, when he found out, made it more difficult for my daughters and I to leave. But by the time I was 25, we finally were able to do it. And my sole purpose and goal was to change that cycle so that it did not repeat itself with my daughters having their children. And coming out of that at 25 years old, this is how the trauma formed in my body. Again, my body and mind were a diseased a place for disease to manifest. I had hypertension. I was obese at 240 pounds. I had migraines, insomnia, irregular periods, flashbacks, intense fear, unwanted thoughts, hypervigilance. I was suspicious of everyone. In fact, my belief was that everyone was out to create harm towards me. It was just a matter of time before they did it. So I always had these continual thoughts of how would this person eventually harm me and all of the steps I would take to either avoid that or get out of that. I also had nightmares and terrors, anxiety, depression, memory issues, and I was also a smoker.
So at age 25, you were taking care of two little girls and still
Yes.
dealing with all this, what you're talking about, all the
Y-
psychological, physics, right?
yes. And my daughters at that point were 8 and 4. And of course, they now had their trauma.
Yeah, yeah.
So, as I said before, what we feel, think, and experience, it circulates through our entire body. So when there's happiness and trust, that is a breeding ground for health and wellness. But when there is sadness and fear and trauma and anger, etc., like I had, that is disease circulating through the entire body. And this is what that looked like. I was completely disconnected from my heart, from my mind. I had learned how to ignore my feelings because I had dealt with so much emotional pain. I had learned to just completely avoid my mind in many ways, as well as ignore my body. So I did not have a real good relationship with myself at this point.
And what did you do to support yourself at that time and your family? I mean, your two daughters.
Well, that's a really good question. So when we left, the intention was change the cycle of dysfunction, which also meant I had to become healthier and look at myself while making sure they had the support they needed from professionals who could also help them. So we got into therapy, and I immediately started looking for a different profession that would allow me to take care of them in the way that I wanted. So it
Mhm.
couldn't be a typical 9 to 5.
Yeah.
So that's where I, decided to change professions and ended up in the healing arts. So Charaka, one of the main authorities of Ayurveda, he says Hridaye Chaitanastanam, which means the seat of consciousness resides in the heart. And this is what has driven my vision. If there is more awareness within the heart, which is also the seat of consciousness, it's also where aspects of the mind are, then one can become more healthy. So, how do you create an understanding and loving relationship with your heart mind, especially when there's been so much trauma? Well, first we have to understand what is relationship. At this point, my understanding of relationship was pretty skewed. So, relationship is the way in which two or more concepts, objects, or people are connected, or the state of being connected. So, if I was trying to develop a better relationship with myself, I first needed to be able to observe my conditioning. I had 25 years of conditioning that was very dysfunctional and very traumatic. I also had to become aware of my thoughts and my feelings. And I also had to look at my self-talk, which was missing self-love. I needed courage and I needed commitment. I needed courage to see myself where I was, even though I didn't want to be where I was. I also needed courage to change. Now, the interesting thing here is when when you're on the verge of fear or excitement, which is what my experience was when it came to change and having courage, this feeling of butterflies in the stomach, which is what I get, was actually a triggering feeling because that was the feeling of, uh-oh, something's bad's about to happen that I grew up with. So in order to change, I also was getting triggered and I had to continually face that feeling every time I tried to move forward. So that's where I needed courage and I needed commitment. I needed commitment to learn to love myself first and essentially date myself. And what I discovered through that dating process was that my past skills were amazing for keeping me alive and getting me to the point of leaving that type of life. But those skills were very harmful in healthier relationships. If my thought and belief is that everyone is going to create harm eventually, and I'm continually looking over my shoulder or planning ahead my next move, I'm not able to be present in a relationship, nor am I able to trust. So I essentially had to unlearn all of those skills in order to learn new skills that would be more healthy and more balanced. I needed to change how I was relating with my story. So, how do you change how you relate with your story? So, whatever your story, I want you to imagine that you're hearing it from a small child. Now, essentially, this is your inner child, but that may be too abstract of a concept. It might be a triggering concept. For me, in the beginning, it was a very triggering concept because the sight of innocence reminded me of what was lost for myself. So whatever your story, I want you to imagine you're just hearing it from another child. How would you respond so that that child felt seen, heard, and comforted in ways that allow for growth and independence? This is the foundation of the adhere process that I developed, was a lot of this inner child work and being able to be compassionate towards those aspects of ourselves. In doing this work, you need opposite qualities, and Ayurveda is all about using opposite qualities to come into balance. Darkness needs light, ignorance needs wisdom, and judgment needs self-love. Each moment is an opportunity for growth. So when a rogi, which is the Ayurvedic term for patient, when a rogi comes in and sits in front of me and they're seeking my advice, what they don't realize is that I'm actually learning quite a bit from them. Whether they've said something that, creates the urgency to maybe go study up on some herb, or maybe they've said something that's triggered something within me that points out where I need to grow. This is the beauty of relationships. No matter what relationship you're in, the purpose of relationship is to help you grow if you understand how to work with the dynamic of relationship. But now what happens when you're in an adversarial moment where you're getting triggered and upset and you want to point the finger at that person? Well, it's certainly an opportunity to grow because that person has just either done something, said something that has triggered a response in you that has just stirred up something that was already there. And when you're there pointing the fingers, this is going to sound cliche, but there are 3 fingers pointing back at you. And what those 3 fingers are pointing at, they're saying, let your triggers be your teacher. That insecurity, that uncertainty, that anger, it is pointing out that which is already there and needs to be healed. The second finger is saying, question your thoughts. This is where I found the work of Byron Katie very helpful for thought questioning. Now, earlier I mentioned that I had this belief that everyone was out to create harm, and it was only a matter of time. So I had to question that belief because it certainly wasn't serving me. And the first question was, is it true? So as I thought about this, I thought, well, okay, my past says it's true, but I don't know for certain it's true, which is the second question. How do you know for certain? I don't have any concrete evidence. I do have history, but no concrete present evidence. So who would I be without this thought? That was the mind-blowing question, because my entire life, all of my decisions were pretty much driven from a triggered and survival place. Well, what if I was no longer in that mindset? Who would I be? And the possibilities were endless. That third finger that's pointing back at you is an acronym for fear. Face everything and rise. That means when you're feeling insecure, instead of running away from it or trying to argue with whoever you're interacting with that's bringing up that insecurity, the ability to turn around and face it and look at yourself. So the scaredy cat here on this slide reminds me of my 3-year-old grandson. He comes over to our house. When he sees one of our cats, he runs in the opposite direction away from the cat. And he says, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. And you can see that this little child has fear all over him, but he's trying to self-regulate by telling himself he's not afraid, which is great. But what Grandma notices is that he's running away from it. So I hold his hand and I ask him, Xavier, what are you not afraid of? And he says, Grandma, I'm not afraid of the cat. And I said, okay, let's see if that's true. And so we go and we approach the cat and I pet the cat to show him that he doesn't need to be afraid. Now that hasn't changed the fear yet, but it's showing him the process of facing it. So a little bit more of the timeline. As I mentioned earlier when Amita asked, we got into therapy, and this is where I learned that the details of my story actually create trauma, even for the professionals. this was not going to work very well for me because I needed somebody who could help guide me to get to the core of healing as well as changing these cycles of dysfunction. So that led me all the way into seeing a psychiatrist who recommended Zoloft and Prozac, which I was very open to taking, but nobody could get me to a point of here's what you do in order to not depend on those medications as well as healing the core of the trauma. So eventually I came off of those, and that's where I sought out more alternative types of healing. And at 25, I started my own practice called Goodbye Tension. The beginning theory here was only to provide for my children. I became a massage therapist for the sole purpose of just providing. I had never had a massage before. It was a very logical decision. Turns out I was actually really good at it. And through that process, a lot of my trauma was coming to the surface. So while I'm building my practice, the types of clients that are coming in are trauma survivors. And I questioned whether or not I was the appropriate person to be handling this. I mean, after all, I was still healing. But the universe has a very unique way of bringing things together, and turns out this is exactly what I was supposed to be doing. So as time went on, I'm learning how to heal myself. I'm bringing everything that I've learned into my practice. I either learned it or became certified. My children were healing through alternative types of therapy. And remember earlier, I was obese at 240 pounds. Well, from 25 to 30, I lost 90 pounds. And I did this naturally, but I did this very extreme, and that's what eventually led me to Ayurveda. What I had done to my body was actually quite abusive, not only to body, but also to mind and to gut, just to get down to that magic number that the medical chart said I should be at. So I went from one end of the spectrum all the way to the other, and I had completely depleted myself. During that time, I was also introduced to yoga and meditation, very beneficial for the mind. I still practice them both regularly, and I do highly recommend them for anyone who's had any type of trauma. And then this is the most important piece, especially when it comes to cycles repeating, is I met my current husband. And why this is so important is because I had finally done enough work that I attracted a different type of partner. And that's where more healing began, especially for my children. They had no father. He was completely out of the picture by the time I left. And so my husband decided in order for them to heal the father principle within them, he was going to adopt them. And so with their permission, around adolescent and teenage years, he adopted them. And so that healing began. Well, as I said earlier, I had depleted my system, and eventually I came to know Dr. J at Kerala Ayurveda Academy. So I had an incident that took me to an emergency room, and Western medicine couldn't figure out what it was. They had no diagnosis, nor could they really see much of how this event happened. And so they diagnosed it as a quote unquote spell. So I thought to myself, maybe I need a witch doctor. And I'm only partially joking about that. But so anyway, I met Dr. J, and I found out about Ayurveda from a book that my husband had gifted me early on in our relationship, Yoga and Ayurveda from Dr. David Frawley. So it just so happens Kerala Ayurveda was 10 minutes from our home. Scheduled an appointment, sat in front of Dr. J, and after 90 minutes of him checking my pulse, looking at my tongue, looking at my eyes and my nails, which I found very fascinating, he said, "I have a plan for you." And I thought, how interesting. Western medicine plus thousands of dollars did all of these tests, couldn't figure anything out. And this gentleman sitting in front of me telling me he has a plan. I certainly want to learn more. Since it was an academy, I decided to learn that healing art just as a way of healing myself. But naturally, everything I've learned, I bring back into my Goodbye Tension practice. And in the meantime, daughters have grown up now, and they've married into healthier relationships than their mom did the first time. And then I became a grandma. And the most recent, both of my daughters, they were pregnant 2 weeks apart were their due dates. Well, they ended up going into labor around the same time. And I was able to physically be there with one in the delivery room. And thanks to technology, I was able to be there on FaceTime with the other. And so both granddaughters were born 5 hours apart from each other in July. And I have to tell you that when you've gone through what I have, with the purpose of changing these cycles, here comes the next cycle. And their moms are healthier than their grandma was, which means there's more hope that the cycle of dysfunction is less likely to repeat itself with them. And then, of course, I've continued on with my Ayurvedic training, and I'm currently in the doctorate program. So what I've done is I've taken the negative experiences, which definitely are a minus, but when you add awareness, they become a plus. And all that emotional baggage and trauma is actually turned into an unusually large bag of experiences and tools. So now the 5 key ingredients for stability using the wisdom of Ayurveda: food, water, breath, lifestyle, and perception. These are the key factors to stability in any condition. So no matter what, these are the most important. When it comes to suggesting herbs and medicines, those are also important, but these 5 factors are the foundation to support those herbs working. So the first one is food, eating wholesome food. Now I try to eat closest from farm to table so that there's a lot less processing. And I recommend that as well. If you can eat organic, great. If you can't, just try to get as fresh as possible, reducing the processing, reducing the canned items, etc. And then there's eating at the proper time. So ideally, eating your breakfast sometime, before 7:30, eating your lunch roughly between the 12:30 and 2 time frame, and then dinner somewhere between 6 to 7:30. Now, don't worry, if your current schedule is all over the place, there is a way to slowly bring this routine to norm, but we don't want any extreme changes. So when you have an assessment, the practitioner will guide you so that you can make those changes slowly, so that it's easier on your system. Next is water. Well, I was actually drinking too much water because of the intense workouts I was doing. I was drinking 1.5 gallons of water a day. So I was drinking too much water. I had to learn how to reduce that. And I was also drinking ice cold water. So my digestive fire, my Agni, was being dampened because of the amount of water I was drinking and the temperature. So room temperature to warm water is highly recommendable to keep that digestive fire strong, as well as increasing your metabolism. So next is breath. Now, wherever the breath goes, the mind follows. So I usually start by teaching my yogis deep diaphragmatic breaths and becoming consistent with a deep diaphragmatic breath practice. There are other more detailed types of breathing, like alternate nostril breathing, but first, just learning how to connect with the breath is a good start. The other ones can be built upon that foundation. And then lifestyle. So your lifestyle and your routine is based on when you sleep. Now, this is where I learned that the mind has a digestive fire just like the gut. And sleep is mind at rest. And did you know that there are certain hours where the mind digests? I didn't know that until I came to Ayurveda. That time is between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. So if you're a night owl where you get that second burst of energy around that time, well, it makes sense. The fire element is all about transformation. It makes sense that you have that burst of energy, but what you're missing out on is that energy is supposed to be helping the mind digest, So all of those adverse experiences that happened in the past, as well as anything that needed to be assimilated through the day, happens between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. when you're sleeping. The next is alone time. Now, this is not something specific that Ayurveda has spoken about. It is something that I highly recommend from my personal experience. So remember, you're trying to create a better relationship with yourself. Well, you can't do that unless you have time to spend with yourself. And oftentimes when I ask people, how do you spend alone time? They say, oh, well, I go and I do my workout. The workout should be separate. This is time where you're alone without so much external stimulation so that you can really tune inwards and find out what's going on. What are you truly feeling? What are you thinking? Etc. And then finally, perception. Well, we're talking all about a mind imbalance. Perception is how we ingest through the mind, and it's through our senses and how we're able to transform what we've ingested. So what we see, what we hear, what we touch, taste, and smell, those are all how we ingest. So we need to be aware of all of that stimulation. Is it too much? Is it not enough? Is it appropriate? For example, is watching a horror film something that is going to help your mental digestion? Probably not. And now for the process that I created through this healing journey called ADHERE. And it's an acronym, EDHIR, but it also is the English word adhere, to adhere to something, which means to be true to. And this acronym stands for explore, discover, heal, integrate, and relate. Now, some of the things that adhere can help with, when you feel stuck in life, you don't necessarily even need to know what you're stuck in, just an overall feeling of being stuck. Learning to live in the present moment, being able to manifest the life that you want, resolving conflict, physical, mental, and emotional healing, as well as relieving anxiety, depression, and all forms of stress, and then, of course, the big one, trauma. So the first phase, explore. This is where you're exploring what is going on that is creating such a barrier for you. So as you connect with your breath, coming into a more relaxed state, I will guide you to explore within. And it's just an exploration. And what do you do when you explore? Well, eventually you discover. And so as you're guided with an open mind to discover without judgment, you'll be able to see what needs attention. And oftentimes this is where you may meet your inner child. And once you meet that inner child, it will become clear what needs to heal. The most rewarding part as you begin to heal these aspects of yourself that have been disconnected. Now, when I say an aspect's been disconnected, earlier when I said I was disconnected from my heart, my mind, my body. So when one experiences a traumatic event, one can leave the body, one can disconnect from the heart. And the way I see it is a version of me in that time left myself and stayed in a time loop. So every time I would get triggered, that particular aspect would start reliving that sort of trauma. That's the aspect that needs to be healed. That's the inner child that's stuck in that moment. And so that's where this healing phase comes in, where you get to meet that version of yourself that you've either been avoiding or disconnected from. Healing can happen. And then the next phase is integration. So you're bringing that healed aspect into union with you. You're mending that hole that was in, creating wholeness. And then the most important is relating. So now is the time where you get to enter into a relationship with the upgraded version of yourself. Who you were in phase 1 through 3 is not who you are once you complete phase 4 and 5. You will need to get to know yourself better. And you also need to be aware that those around you may notice that something has changed. And this is where I refer to weeding your garden. Sometimes certain flowers need space in order to grow, and there's nothing wrong with asking for space. Sometimes people are okay with giving space, and sometimes it triggers them. And it's an opportunity for them to look at what's triggering them, or it may be an opportunity to be in a different garden. All of this is normal for growth and change. This journey, it begins with you. When you are healthy and balanced, your relationships become healthy and balanced. When your relationships are healthy and balanced, communities become healthy and balanced. And when communities are healthy and balanced, the world becomes healthy and balanced. And with everything going on in this day and age, I think we can all agree we need to be working on ourselves for the sake of the future generations as well as the future of our world. Thank
Beautiful
you very
story.
much.
Beautiful, beautiful story. Such an inspiring story. I mean, you are such an inspiration, Jeannine, with what you have accomplished, and now you're writing a book. I mean, it's like incredible story.
Thank you, Amita.
So, I wanted to bring out. You mentioned about the alone time. So, does meditation count as alone time, or is it like when you mean alone time, meaning like introspecting and kind of sitting by yourself? What exactly did you mean by alone time?
For me personally, I see meditation as part of my stability practice. It is part of the alone time, but I'm speaking more about time where maybe you take yourself on a nature walk without headphones, without any other distractions, and you sit in nature and you convene with nature so that you can get in touch with the nature of what's going on within you. So at first it could look like meditation time, and that's great. Mine has evolved to having more time in nature or having time where I just sit with what is, introspect on the thoughts I've had, maybe around a certain circumstance or interaction. Maybe sometimes I'll play some instrumental music and I will just dance just with myself. Movement is really important for trauma survivors because we tend to have that fight or flight and freeze response. So to be able to move freely, and I'll talk more about that in my book, is super important because to feel free within your own body, that takes some work.
Well, we open for questions. I see quite a few people in Zoom. You are welcome to ask questions. It's going to be confidential. Jeannine is sharing her screen. I am not sharing my screen. So if you put any questions in the chat window, you're welcome to ask questions. So let me see. Okay, yeah, you're welcome to ask questions. So you talked about while someone is thinking about any questions, you talked about the healing process. When how long did it take you to really meet your phase 4 and 5? What you were talking about, the new person you are to
Mm.
the old person you were when you had so many issues with the weight and other medical issues as well. So, what was the time span of this whole journey? I think that's very important for people to understand.
Right. Well, I will tell you, it is a continual process. So I continually work these steps on a regular basis because the way the psyche is you can deal with a certain amount within
Mhm.
your capacity. Once you heal, then there's more capacity, which means that which you couldn't look at before now can be dealt with.
Yeah.
So it's similar to peeling away layers of an onion, for example. It gets sweeter the deeper you go. But at first, it's burning and you're crying. So I like to use that analogy. But to answer your question, so it was 18 years to the day on October 11th that I left that abusive relationship. So I have been on a continual path of healing that whole time. some of the key points of what I learned is even when you're doing mental and emotional work, you cannot just charge through it. And my personality at the time was more of a, okay, let's just charge through it and get it done. Let's just charge through it and lose 90 pounds. And that's really not a healthy approach. So if I could go back and tell that version of myself some wisdom, it would be, don't treat yourself like a machine. You can only do up to a point of which you're able, and you have to honor that. Then you'll stabilize, and once you're stable, then you can move forward again. So that's probably the biggest key factor, I would say, in this process is the ability to just honor where you're at, and where you're at is beautiful. Once you go past it, you don't go backwards. So it's beautiful right where you're at, and it'll be beautiful right where you're going.
And one of the things you did also mention is that if we don't take care of our demons or some of the unresolved emotions, the same thing repeats itself. Or we meet someone, same kind of a person who will be abusive to us, or something else that would happen that we just had before. So
Right.
so right. So is there like a theory behind it? I mean, it's really an interesting way the way you explained it. Like we
Yeah.
all.
Well, so I'll use my story as an example. So all I knew about life was dysfunction and abuse.
Yeah.
There were a few moments of seeing that my friend's environment was very different, but it was so extremely different, I couldn't relate to it.
Yeah.
All I knew is that the situation I was in, I needed to leave. So I leave it. But now all of my energy is that of a victim, dysfunction, and abuse. So
Yeah.
if that's the energy that I have, that's the energy that I'm also attracting.
I
And
see.
that's how
Because
I ended up right there. And that's how, so many women I know who have been, in domestic violence situations or abuse, they will talk about the same thing that, oh, they got out of one relationship and then ended up right back there. Why? Leaving it is great. That's a must. But you have to be able to look at it. Otherwise, you're just running.
you have to heal yourself at that
You
point.
have to look at yourself. You have to look at the part of you that has
Yeah.
literally subscribed to, I deserve this. This is a part of me. Those are all
Yeah.
things that happen when you are abused. You tend to believe, oh, well, yeah, that's just what happens. It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be that way, but you have to change that thought. You have to change that belief.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah.
you have to heal yourself first. I mean, in an ideal situation before you get into any more relationships, or at least you have to start the healing,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, in Ayurveda, we do the Shodhana and the Shamana phase. This is definitely Shodhana.
Mhm.
You start doing the Shodhana, the clearing out of all that is no longer serving you.
Mhm.
Then you stabilize the Shamana, and then you do the Rasayana phase, which is, where you rejuvenate and you start thriving.
I see. Okay. Okay. But the other thing is what I want to bring out. You're welcome to ask questions. I don't want to be the one asking questions, but okay. This is a very sensitive topic. So
It
sometimes.
is a very sensitive topic, and I know a lot of people are a little afraid to do it on a public forum, but I think we have some future
Yeah.
endeavors with Nourish Doc that may help people feel more comfortable to talk about this sort of thing.
Yes, because we are actually recording it and also streaming it live on Facebook at the same time. So I can totally understand, why someone might find reservations and asking questions. My last question is on the trigger. So let's say you've healed yourself, hypothetically, anyone for that matter,
Right.
not, but in this case, it's your story. So if you met someone after you've gone through the healing process, the person who gave you the trauma, the person who was the reason for your, at that time, a mental abuse or whatever you want to call it,
Hmm.
how can the new person handle that, or would you still get triggered? Is the question.
That is a fabulous question. I'm so glad you brought it up. So it's important to know which relationships, first of all, that you will keep, and which ones are not appropriate anymore, especially if there was a victim perpetrator relationship.
Mhm.
Now, I tried both with my mother and my father. I tried going back and trying to have that relationship.
Mhm.
And what I learned was I deeply care and love for my parents. I could not always say that, though, just to be clear.
Yeah.
And I realized that my life does not have space for that type of dysfunction.
Yeah.
Now, if they were working on their stuff, then I may be open to a side relationship, but I'm not open to my family
Hmm.
being in relationship with that sort of thing at
Yeah.
this point, and for the rest of this life, because the pattern has shown a continuous repeat on their side.
Yeah.
Now, if I've been triggered by, let's say, a friend who maybe they did something that was not appropriate or whatever, and I see and we can talk about it, and they are aware of their actions, I'm aware of my actions, and it's clear that there's an intention of awareness and growth, that's an opportunity for change. I would suggest if you have the capacity, then try. But
Hmm.
be aware of what your capacity is. You may not have the capacity. So with this healing work, it lets the abusers off the hook
Hmm.
once you do the healing, because then you're no longer accusing, you're no longer pointing the finger, you're no longer feeling like a victim. You then are able to see them as, wow, they're broken too. And in
Yeah.
their brokenness, they didn't have the courage and commitment to work on it. And that's where you can have compassion, not that you need to have a continuous relationship with them, because really it's all about you. So
And it,
did that answer your question?
yeah. No,
Yeah,
I mean it's hard, especially with in this case, in your case, with parents kind of not being part of your future generations, sort of
right.
like. And it happens with a lot of us, a lot of I think all over women or men, to that you have to make a determination, So I
Yeah,
don't know what to say, but that's kind of what you're saying is you have to look at yourself first and heal yourself.
yeah. And every time you get triggered, just take note and go work on it, because that means something's unresolved within you. And you eventually you will get to a point where you go looking for triggers.
Mhm.
And that, comes in the later phases. I still get triggered. Don't get me wrong. I'm still
Yeah,
very human.
yeah,
It's just my ability to relate with those triggers is different. My ability to take care of myself and not be pulled under. Because
mhm.
before it would feel like I was taken under, like deep into the depths of the ocean, and I couldn't climb out or swim out.
Yeah.
Now it just feels like I'm on a boat and, oh, my boat's being rocked.
Mhm.
So, and it's in a storm. And where's the calmest place of the storm? Dead center. That means I
Yeah.
have to be centered within myself in order to be able to see clearly. When you're in a fight or flight response, the ocular nerve actually, the ability for the ocular nerve to work is dampened. So it's very metaphorical as well. Your ability to see when you're in a fight or flight is very limited. So my protocol is, if I'm triggered, I don't make any decisions, because any decision I make is going to be from a triggered place. And that's not the life that I want. So I have to be real with myself and go, well, I can't make a decision today. I can't make a decision in this moment. Maybe tomorrow.
Yes, yes. All right. That's wonderful. That's great. I think if people are just have reservations asking questions, I can totally understand. We are going to be offering these workshops in a more confidential setting, where we are not streaming it, live on Facebook. This is being streamed on live on Facebook, and I'm so thankful to Jimmy for sharing your story. I think it will help
Yeah.
a lot of other women. Any final comments from you before we end this session?
I would just like to say that, whatever your story is, whatever you've experienced, you're not alone. There is a way to go through this and heal. As Amita said, we're going to be working on some workshops. You can also reach out to me at goodbyetension.com. But have hope. Try to have hope. And if you don't have hope, definitely reach out so that we can support you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Jeannine. And please feel free to give us your feedback in confidence if you like. or share this session. We would really love that if you can share this session to help someone else who's going through a trauma right now, or who's trying to figure out how to heal themselves. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Jeannine, for being with us.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye. Bye now.